Hello and welcome to the Luke Lunchtime Takeaway. Week by week, we're traveling with Jesus through Luke's Gospel to his cross and his resurrection. If you find somebody who believes something that you reject, what we often do is we take their argument, their position, and we reason it to a completely absurd logical conclusion to try and disprove it. For example, if a politician believes that it might be important to change our NHS and replace it with a new system, then politicians on the other side will say, well, I hope before you get in the back of the ambulance that you've got your credit card with you because you're going to need it, whether you're comatose or you can actually think, you're going to need to pay for your healthcare and so on. And we use that kind of logical absurdity to try and destroy the other side's argument. Now, some people came to Jesus and they tried to do that in Luke 20, verses 27 to 40. They were a group that we call the Sadducees, and it's the only time they get a mention in Luke's Gospel. They were people who believed that there was no life after death, that there was no resurrection from the dead. This life is all there is, and when we die, we're gone. And they came to Jesus with a very clever argument. They said, verse 28, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." So they're setting up a conundrum here, and they're absolutely right. The law of Moses provided that if a man had no children when he died, his widow, well, she could marry one of his brothers, and any children that they would have would be raised up in the name of her first husband. We call it levirate marriage, and you can see it happening, for example, in the story of Ruth, in the book of Ruth. The extended family in Israel had responsibilities to carry on the name of the family down the line. But this is where the Sadducees pick up on this, and they use it as a sort of logically absurd argument. This is their scenario. There's a man, and he has 7 brothers, and he marries a wife, and then soon after he dies, and they don't have any children. So to do his duty, the second brother marries the woman, and they don't have any children either, and he dies. So the third brother comes along, apparently he's still available, and he marries her. And again, there are no children, and he dies. And you're starting to ask yourself by now, what is this lady doing to all these brothers? What is she poisoning them with that they're all dying? Does she really not want to be a mother? And all those sorts of questions are going through your mind. But it is a logically absurd situation. Every one of these 7 brothers marries this lady in turn. It's one bride for 7 brothers. And each of the brothers dies. And at the end of it all, the woman herself dies. Now, here comes the killer punch for their argument. They say, verse 33, "In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be?" Now, you can see the way that they're arguing. Isn't the resurrection an utterly stupid idea? Here's a logical absurdity that proves that it just can't happen. And sometimes people do that today. On Good Friday in 2021, Professor Alice Roberts posted this tweet. "Just a little reminder today, dead people don't come back to life." And the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron, who's a Christian, replied, "That's kind of the point. If they did, then the resurrection wouldn't prove the existence of God. And anyway, you're 2 days early." Don't argue against the resurrection on Good Friday. It's Easter Sunday when Jesus rose from the dead. Now, we can take Alice Roberts' argument and try and argue from what normally happens, but that's not going to help us, is it? Resurrection is something that doesn't happen every day. And therefore, if we're going to get a grip on this idea, we've got to listen to a person who has come back from the dead. And that person, of course, is Jesus. And here he is before he's died and risen again. And he's saying very clearly, look, in the afterlife, marriage doesn't happen. Marriage is for now, for this life, because this life is where we need to carry on the human race, and one generation gives way to another. But what about the life to come? Well, Jesus is the Son of God. He's come from heaven. He, of all people, ought to know what is really going on after death and what eternity is like. And this is what he says in verse 35. Those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection of the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die any more. Jesus says that even though we die, all of us one day will have our bodies raised back to life. And those who trust in Jesus and know God will be the ones who enter into eternal life in a new creation, a glorious renewed body for a glorious renewed world. And Jesus adds these words in verse 36, they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. Those who enter eternal life don't need marriage anymore. They don't have to perpetuate the human race because nobody dies. There's no longer any need for birth because there's no longer any death. And therefore, the bigger relationship is not our relationships with each other, but our relationship with God. We are children of God, and we enjoy face-to-face fellowship with him for all eternity in a new creation. And Jesus gives one final argument to prove that. And he takes his listeners back to the beginning of the story of Exodus, where God appears to Moses in the burning bush. And God speaks to Moses out of the bush. And he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God spoke to Moses about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not as people who had died and were gone, but as people, yes, their bodies have died and been buried, but they themselves, their souls, are alive with him in heaven. And Jesus adds, now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live in him. The Sadducees tried to take on Jesus and to rubbish his arguments, but they bit off more than they could chew. Jesus himself proved that there is life after death by rising from the dead on that first Easter day. And by his resurrection, he has vindicated all his claims. He has proved that he is the Son of God. His miracles all add up and make sense in the light of this final miracle, his resurrection from the dead. Isn't it better to give up on fighting this idea that there is life after death, fighting the idea of the resurrection from the dead, and to admit that in a world of war and death and evil, God himself has come near. He has become one of us in Jesus. By his death, he has broken the power of death and evil. And by his resurrection, he has proved that we too, you and me, can have eternal life in him. Well, come with me over the coming few weeks as we carry on our journey towards Easter and we consider the great claims of Jesus. Thank you for joining me, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.